Hi there. Good evening. Uh, Thanks to everyone who's calling in, and thanks especially to Robin Wall Kimmerer for joining us on screen for Oregon Humanities Consider This program. Robin, it's great to see you.
And you as well, Adam. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So, my name's Adam Davis. I'm with Oregon Humanities, and I should say right here at the start that I am not in Portland, Oregon as usual. I'm in Washington, D.C. And Robin, maybe you could just tell us where you are?
Yeah, I'm calling in from on a snowy evening in upstate New York, in the hills south of Syracuse, New York, in Maple Nation.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us from Maple Nation. And I should say that normally the way we would start a Consider This program is by thanking organizations that made it possible. And I want to do that. I want to do that shortly, but also in reading Braiding Sweetgrass and Gathering Mosses and other writings of yours, noticed how much you pay attention to gratitude and to ceremony and ritual, and wanted to ask if there was a way that you would want us to start this conversation tonight.
Miigwech for that consideration. Um, Remember that we have everything that we needed. We have that first breath of morning air and the sound of birds. We had a drink of water. We had food from the earth. We had each other. We had the privilege of living on Turtle Island at this moment in time. And so we say to one another, Miigwech kinegego, gamijang, of gratitude for everything that we have been given.
Thank you. Thank you for starting us that way. And it's interesting, we were talking about this just before, that we're going to have this conversation. There may be slight delay. There may be moments when we cut out, and we're going to do what we can to make this as present a conversation for each other and especially for the people watching. And thank you for starting to ground us as you have with gratitude. I want to express a little bit of gratitude and also let people calling in know what the layout's going to be for this evening. And so I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities. There's an initiative called A More Perfect Union, and that's helping fund this. The Oregon
Mm.
Cultural Trust, the Susan Hammer Fund of Oregon Community Foundation, the Standard Stoll Reeves, the Kinsman Foundation, and the City of Portland's We Are Better Together program. Those organizations have helped make this and lots of other work around the state possible. And I just really want to say thank you for that. I also want to note that in about an hour, we will invite those of you that are calling in to talk to each other through the magic, the wondrous magic and strange magic of Zoom. My colleague at Oregon Humanities, Roselle Medina, is going to be facilitating small group conversations to build off what Robin's talking about this evening. And then again on March 15th, we're going to be talking about Robin's essay, Speaking of Nature. So that's another way to keep the conversation going based on what Robin's talking about tonight. So that said, and on the basis of how you started us as well, Robin, I guess given the theme, American Dreams, American Myths, American Hopes, I want to note that the titles of your books and much of the meat of the books are about plants, sweetgrass, mosses, many other kinds of plants, maples. And yet, there are words in those books like government and revolution and duty and democracy that show up a good bit. So, as we ease into exploring the theme, I wanted to ask you right here at the start, do you think of yourself as a political person, as a sort of, do you think of these books as political books? Maybe that's a way to start.
That's a good question. I certainly didn't conceive of them as political books. um, but I understand, of course, that by presenting an alternative to the kind of dominant conventional Western worldview, it certainly challenges colonialism, challenges the status quo, and invites us to consider ourselves and how we organize one another in relationship to each other and certainly to the land in different ways. So while I didn't intend it that way, I am often really grateful when folks say, "Oh, this is a dangerous book," and I felt like, "Oh, great." Yeah.
Dangerous, great. Yeah, and dangerous, politically dangerous in some ways.
Yes, dangerous in challenging dominant thought patterns. Yeah.
Great. Maybe we can stay there a little bit. I'm curious, especially about dominant thought patterns around. So you just mentioned Maple Nation, and in Braiding Sweetgrass, you talk about citizenship of Maple Nation. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see citizenship of Maple Nation contrasting with or aligning with, say, citizenship of the United States. How are those kinds of citizenship similar and how are they different?
Well, one of the challenges that comes with thinking of yourself as a citizen of Maple Nation is certainly grounded in an indigenous perspective, where we view, American political boundaries as imposed artificial lines that sometimes divide our homelands and often divide our homelands. But what I really mean by being a citizen is, what are your shared values? And I think oftentimes our values fail to be rooted in the land. They're not often biocentric or life centered values, they're more anthropocentric. So, by claiming citizenship in Maple Nation, I want to say I belong to a community bigger than humans. Um, I love my human community, but there are way more maple trees where I live than there are people. And those maple trees are playing really important roles as community members. But to human people, they're often invisible. Well, they're just objects, they're just trees. But by claiming citizenship in Maple Nation, you give respect to the non-human persons and recognize, our interdependence. In a way, when we think about sort of American political ideals, this notion of independence, and that a hallmark of our governance system is the Bill of Rights. And I think about a wonderful friend and historian, the late Chief Irving Powless, who of the Onondaga Nation, who would talk about the fact that he said, when we met with the founding fathers of the American democracy, as they did, he said they got a lot of things right, but they kind of messed up because they wrote of the Bill of Rights instead of the Bill of Responsibilities. And to me, that's one of the major contrasts between being a citizen of a political entity and being a citizen of a ecological entity, that we're governed by our responsibilities to each other, not claiming individual rights.
So those are already two powerful differences. One is, I think, a declaration of independence versus a kind of recognition and declaration of interdependence. And then
Mm-hmm.
also a Bill of Rights as contrasted with a Bill of Responsibilities or even duties, which is another word you use.
Mm-hmm.
So can I ask you to, and we're maybe not that great at talking about citizen responsibilities and citizen duties here in this country. We emphasize rights. Can you, like, what should we be responsible for? What are the duties that we have as you see it?
Mm. Well, duty is to recognize that nobody thrives unless everybody thrives. As an ecologist, um, this is what the land tells you. This is what ecological sciences tell you, that we are all connected. We are all related. That there is scarcely such a thing as an I. It's all a great big we, and so that's what I really think about is our responsibilities for sharing with each other, for respecting each other, for in a sense nurturing each other's well-being, because an individual's well-being depends on the well-being of the whole.
So I can nod at that, and then I think about how I spend my day, and I wonder where I fall very short where I fall somewhat short, how rare it is that I'm really thinking of the whole or thinking in a fully ecological way, the way you're describing. As you go through your day, do you feel like here is where I'm living into this vision and here are some ways I fall short? I mean, concretely, how
Oh,
do you, yeah,
oh, sure. All the time. It's kind of a dance, isn't it, between those things that pull us towards efficiency and productivity and all those things that the world demands of us, and to back off from that and remember our responsibilities to each other in a daily basis. You know what really helps me be grounded in trying to live that out is always starting the day with gratitude, with naming all of those beings to whom I'm related in, and not in a generic way, like, when I'm standing outside and the first cardinal of the spring is singing, my thanks go directly there. And then I think, well, what's my responsibility to that cardinal? And it reminds me to fill the bird feeder in a very tangible kind of way of reciprocity. You gave me a song this morning, and the least I can do is offer you some sunflower seeds. That's an easy one, right? But that's for me kind of a model of what I hope to be able to do, is to say, well, in return for the gift of being a scientist, you know what am I going to do about that? How do I pay that back? um, with my students, with my writing. um, it's trying to hold yourself accountable to the gifts and to the privileges that you have. Do I do that 24/7? Of course not. It is an aspiration at which I often fail. But the small acts of taking out the compost is my act of reciprocity with the soil that feeds me. Putting solar panels on my house is an act of reciprocity. So there are big things like solar panels and little things like compost, but I hope that they all add up.
compost certainly adds up. I think, you write about the Thanksgiving address in Braiding Sweetgrass as an alternative to the Pledge of Allegiance. And it's it's certainly not like it's a bigger commitment than the Pledge of Allegiance, just in terms of what it asks of the people that would speak it.
Yeah.
And you also talk about how it's a kind of civics curriculum. And so maybe I want to ask a little bit about that. What is the Thanksgiving address, and how does that function as a kind of civics?
Mm. Where I live here in Haudenosaunee territory, I live in the ancestral and contemporary territories of the Onondaga Nation, and the Thanksgiving address is what they call the words that come before all else. They're words that start off every gathering, and it is a reminder to be grateful for the gifts that are around us. And when done by really eloquent elders, it can take an hour, Adam, to thank all of the beings. And what I love about it is the thank you is to the maples, let's say, and calling them out as the leaders of the trees. And then you're asked to reflect, what does that mean to be a leader? What does that mean to be a leader of the trees, to be the first one to care for the people at the end of a long and hungry winter? That tells you something about your civic responsibility, to care for each other, to give whatever gift you bring. And you then go on to talk about the responsibilities and gifts of Grandmother Moon, and the waters, and the three sisters, and the berries, and the fish, and every one of them is named and thanked for fulfilling their duty to others. And they're often named in great detail. It is a kind of an ecological inventory, but it's also a pledge to learn from those beings. As you are generous, I should be generous too. As you are a leader, I need to be a leader. As you show us compassion and guidance, shouldn't we be reciprocating that?
Mm-hmm.
So it is a long inventory of those beings for whom we need to be grateful. And I think I write about this in Braiding Sweetgrass, that when my students are learning about the Thanksgiving address and they listen to it, they say, "Oh, that's so beautiful! It's so meaningful. It helps ground me." And they said, "But it's so long," which I love it when they complain. I think, "Oh, poor you! You have too much to be grateful for," um, and and the fundamental orientation toward abundance that the Thanksgiving address gives you. My friend Frida Jacques, who is a clan mother at Onondaga, she will often talk about the fact that when you're done listening to or participating in the Thanksgiving address, you feel so wealthy. You feel like you have everything that you need. And that orientation to abundance stands in direct contrast to the orientation to scarcity that our capitalist economy demands of us. So when you feel like you have everything you need, you don't necessarily need to go out and buy anything.
There was a lot in what you just said, and also your reminder about gratitude reminded me that I really wanted to thank all the people who signed up for this program and sent in questions, and many people sent in really wonderful questions. And so I want to say thanks to everybody that did that, and they have informed the way we're thinking about this, and I hope they'll also show up in what follows as you talk to each other. And you talk about questions, and I was a little reluctant to ask direct questions because you talk about traditions where direct questions and indirect questions have a different weight or a different kind of recognition. But I may move in the direction of direct questions because we do have not as much time as I would like, but maybe it's the
Sure.
beginning of a conversation. Um, I want to ask about, on the one hand, this really feeling and naming and recognizing all that we should be grateful for. And in your example, you referred to the Onondaga, for example. And there's also real injustice that's been done. And to try to how to hold these two together, the sense of injustice on one hand and gratitude on the other.
Hmm. I'm really interested that you're putting those in tension with one
Great,
another,
great.
because I don't necessarily find them so.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the injustices, not only of history, but the continuing injustices associated with colonialism and the tremendous inequities. Um, to me, they're separate things. The gratitude that we feel for our beingness, for our relatives, for the land is unchanging and grounds us in a way that allows us both to persevere through injustices and provides a kind of cultural identity and strength that lets you combat injustice. When you have a model of abundance, I think it gives you a platform of more courage and resilience to do the work of healing injustices. Um, it's a really good question. I'm sure I'm going to think about that some more.
Okay, thanks. I mean, it's interesting because this series theme is on dreams, myths, and hopes that are identified with, and we put the word American in front of each of those words.
Mm-hmm.
And hard to hear American dream without thinking about nightmarish parts of this country. It's hard to think of myths without thinking of ideology. And it's hard to think of hopes without thinking of those that aren't realized. And at the same time, going back to, for example, the questions that we received from people planning to join tonight, the word hope showed up in a lot of those questions. And uh, just interesting to note there, you were going to say something, please.
I was. We are in a time when we are so hungry for hope, aren't we? And we are looking for it in many many places. And so I think a lot about hope. And there's one part of me that says that, I'm by nature a really optimistic person who tends to see the positive. Well, of course I am. I'm a botanist. I hang out with plants, so that colors one's worldview. But I am also have the great privilege of being a professor, of being a teacher, and I get to hang out and spend my time and my energy with amazing young people who are so full of ideas and imagination and energy to participate in the great turning that Joanna Macy talks about, right? Of turning away from this worldview of destruction to one of creativity. So I am buoyed up by my students for sure. But honestly, when I think about hope, I'm not really sure what that means to separate it from optimism. To me, I find it hard to separate hope from love, um, because I might hope for a certain kind of future, and it might be wishful thinking, but it doesn't matter because I'm just going to keep on loving the world, and and maybe loving it harder in a damaged state, in a wounded state, right? Um, and I think it's love that is going to help us make the transformation that we need. And what's the connection between love and hope is when we act on the love that we feel. It seems to me that our great failing as a people over the last centuries is that we've really failed to love the land, um, and failed to love the land enough in all of its fullness as a nation of tree citizens, not land as property and land as natural resources and those kinds of myths. Those are good myths for you. Land as property, land as commodity. Yeah, but land as family, as responsibility, as teacher, as identity, as sacred. That's a kind of love of land that I can get behind.
And let's stay with plants a bit. Um, you just talked about, you went straight from talking about being a botanist who studies plants to being a professor buoyed up by students. And it felt to me like you were saying, in a way, the hope that you get from mosses, let's say, is in some ways quite like the hope you get from students. And
It's true.
yeah, I mean, reading Gathering Mosses, I felt like, yes, it was about mosses, but it was also about people.
Hmm.
And it was about the relation between the two. While you were writing Gathering Mosses, like when you go look at moss, do you think about the mosses? Do you think about how the moss functions as a metaphor? Uh, how much is that an explicit part of what you feel like is going on inside of you?
It all happens for me at the same time. I am as a naturalist, as a scientist, I'm incredibly fascinated, of course, by the structure and the function and the ecology of mosses, and to say nothing of how beautiful they are, right? But at the same time, the notion of plants as teachers is so much a part of the lens at which I look at the world. When I look at tiny little mosses, I can't help but think about living simply, and relying on each other, because that's what they're doing. That's how they're surviving. That's how they're blanketing the world with green is by relying on each other, and by not asking much from their environment at all, by living within their ecological means. That's how they live, and so it's the microcosm of the mosses that you could look at like through a microscope. But then there's the telescope of what it means, of what would it be like to live like mosses, and what could we learn from that kind of humility. It's just a truth that I see the world in those kind of metaphors of what do plants have to teach us. They are themselves, and they are their lessons, all in the same beautiful green package.
So that phrase you just spoke, they are themselves, and they are sort of what they mean. You know, a couple different directions I'm hoping we can go. The first is to just follow what you see in the mosses again. And you say at one point, and I'm going to quote you back to yourself. I hope that's okay.
Only if it's good.
Well, you get to decide, but I think I'm quoting it to you because I think it's good. I hold tight to the vision that someday soon we will find the courage of self-restraint, the humility to live like mosses. And you just talked about the humility. I'm curious about courage. What do you mean by the courage of self-restraint? Why courage?
I think separating our needs and our wants and saying to oneself, I have enough, takes some courage, because we're surrounded by messages that are constantly telling us that we're not good enough, we don't have enough, that we need to get more. And so it does take courage to practice self restraint against those messages. There's also a kind of a courage that comes with real humility. And in the Potawatomi way of thinking about humility, of the word edbesendoin, we don't mean it in the same way that English does, of kind of being self-effacing or self-deprecating. What our language teachers tell us that it actually means is that we don't think of ourselves as more important than others, which doesn't mean we're not all really important. But none of us are more important than the others. It's almost an invitation to celebrate the importance of others. And so the courage to recognize that you're not the master of the universe, is what I mean. Just it's a kind of courage associated with humility and lifting up others rather than yourself.
So that brings me back to a phrase that I continue to turn over since I came across it in, I think, first in Braiding Sweetgrass, and that is democracy of species. Let's talk about democracy, but democracy of species. I want to ask the very simple question. What is democracy of species? What do you mean?
Hmm. A way that I like to think about that is maybe with a myth, Adam, given the theme of this conversation, is this myth of human exceptionalism, as if human people were at the top of this fictional pyramid, a pyramid of intelligence, a pyramid of entitlement, a pyramid of who is inspirited and who is not. We tend to think of ourselves as the pinnacle of creation, and all the rest of the beings are below us. That, of course, is not a democracy of species. That's kind of a hierarchical dictator who thinks of all the others as below him or her, and lesser than. Whereas the democracy of species, to me, means no, not a fictional pyramid, but like a beautiful spider web of connection, or a big circle in which all the beings are relatives. They're all equal, not the same as each other. They're all gloriously different, but they have the same claim to the wealth of the world, and they have the same rights to be that human people do. And that's, I mean, by a democracy of species, I mean living in such a way that we recognize the beingness of each other, the personhood of each other, and that we all have a right and a responsibility and a gift to bring to the whole. And that's what democracy is to me, is doing your part, knowing that you're connected, and giving back in return for everything that you've been given. To me, that's democracy, of upholding each other. And I want to live in a world where salamanders have rights, where redwoods have rights. That's what I mean by the democracy of species.
It's funny, I was going to the salamanders in my head when you mentioned them. I was going to that moment when you described being out there with your students,
Hmm.
and in a way the challenge of wanting to measure how cars are affecting the salamander population, and at the same time wanting to save the salamanders that are crossing the road. And the tension between let's do this let's do this science well, which means let's not mess with what's happening, let's measure it. And on the other hand, can't we stop these cars or pick up these salamanders and move them across? And so there I do want to ask about that. Felt like a metaphor as well as what it was, the tension between measuring and understanding and intervening
Yes.
to make a difference.
Yeah.
So
And it's partly the tension between looking at the world as oftentimes scientific method asks us to do, always asks us to do, is to consider the world as object. Um, and the desire to intervene out of compassion for those salamanders considers the world as subject. And Western science, in the form of knowledge generation, kind of asks us for that objectivity. And in that the case of those rainy night of trying to save salamanders, I think there's also the sense that there are multiple ways to save salamanders. We could, as we did, pick them up and carry them across the road. But I think we also save salamanders by doing good salamander science. Because when we talk to policymakers, and we want to have culverts put in or roads closed so that salamanders can safely migrate, we live in a world where they're not going to say, you feel badly for those your kinfolk, the salamanders, therefore we're going to make this change. They listen to data, they listen to evidence. So there is a way in which doing that science saves salamanders in the long run. And so I respect both of those, but they're really different impulses. And I think we have to do both. It's not a matter of either or, but we have to do both, and we have to do them with as much respect and compassion as we can.
and thinking about the word reciprocity that you used before, I want to ask the crude question about sort of what about salamanders' orientation toward us? Like I'm thinking about this idea of the democracy of species, and um, if we want to either save, help, measure, and I think I know where you might go with this, but I'm curious how do you have a sense of how salamanders might regard or should regard humans?
Hmm. What an interesting question. Oh, it's just launching out this wonderful imagining of what that would be to be a salamander crossing the road and saying, who in the world interrupted our soft bed of leaves with asphalt? Where did that come from? Um, do they even know us? Do they even know us? Are our worlds so different that they scarcely imagine us? I don't know. I've not done the exercise of trying to think like a salamander, but I know that what they see very clearly the impacts that we have had on their lives, whether they attribute it to the same beings who are there in a raincoat and a flashlight trying to carry them across the road. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
But more broadly speaking, I think there's an important philosophical construct of saying that we are nonetheless responsible for each other,
Mm.
um, and that just as we view them as kinfolk, deeply other, salamanders are deeply different than we are, but can we still have compassion for them and respect for them? I guess I would want them to have compassion and respect for us. And the other thing I hope that they have for us is forgiveness.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, it's interesting. I think it's because this phrase democracy of species got in my head. And then you say at one point, the dictates of the real government, the democracy of species, the laws of nature. And then, so I was trying to think about the differences between human laws and the laws of nature, uh, and how it would be easier if they aligned in
Oh,
principle, in practice more. But like the laws of human laws in democracy, especially, I think it's a law we try to give to ourselves, and the laws of nature feel like they're from a larger place. And
hmm
so when you say the dictates of the real government, can I just push you to elaborate on that a little bit?
yeah. In that phrasing, what I really mean are the laws of nature, right? And absolutely, that's a call for an alignment of human constructed governance and economies to align with the natural laws. And maybe one of the easiest examples of natural law, that we are so out of balance with in social and economic institutions, is this idea of unlimited growth.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Every day you hear, oh well, we in order to be successful, the economy has to grow. Well, that's not a law of nature. In natural systems, things can't grow indefinitely. They can't. There's finite limits on resources and space and light. Um, Unlimited growth is a construct of human, of being human centric. We want things to grow so we can have more. Why we need more, it's never always clear. But in natural systems fall apart if they try to grow in infinitely. And so why do we model our economy after something which is, violates the laws of thermodynamics in a sense? And there are regenerative economies, circular economies that are much more aligned with the laws of nature, that don't demand endless growth and therefore endless extraction and exploitation.
So I feel like thinking about stories that illustrate larger truth, now I think we're moving in the direction of the Windigo, the story of the Windigo.
Mm.
And just as you were talking, I was thinking, where does where does the Windigo come from? Where does a being that is so out of step with the laws of nature come from? What I'm asking is, where do
Hmm.
we, who build these roads and then need to try to save salamanders from our own cars, where do we come from, given
Mm.
that we seem to come from nature in some way? How did that rupture seem to develop?
Mm. Yeah, there's so many dimensions to your question. Um, let me start with the last latter part of your question. So where did we get this exploitive mindset? I think that is a direct, response to human exceptionalism, to thinking that human beings are different and superior from all other beings. That of course we can build roads through wetlands because those wetlands belong to us. We're in charge here, and it's up to us to do as we wish. Those are some of the direct ideas from the Abrahamic religions, right, of dominion over land, and the idea that humans are at the top of some pyramid, that we alone are sacred beings, as opposed to the notion that we're all sacred beings, salamanders and cattails and maple trees alike. So where did it come from? I think it comes from that religious tradition, quite honestly, of a separation of humans from the rest of our kinfolk. But the first part of your question, where does Windigo come from? Because Windigo may manifest itself in that kind of exploitative economy and domination. But I've thought a lot about this, and Windigo is in every one of us. We have this need for self-preservation, right? That I need to consume in order to keep myself intact, to take care of my own life. At root, that's why a Windigo takes more than their share, because they want to preserve their own life at the cost of others. But where does that come up from? I want to preserve my own life. To me, that's just an evolutionary imperative. That's straight up biology talking. We want it, it is the will to preserve our own lives, and that's why we have culture and stories to say that might be our innate imperative to take care of our own lives. But we have stories and we have culture and we have governance and family structures that put the brakes on that, to say you're not alone here. That food needs to be shared. And so I think that some of the power of our ethical systems is to rein in that quality that lives in all of us.
I think as you're talking, I'm thinking about the complexity of reining in. How hard it is to do something other than the biological imperative.
Mm-hmm.
And I love your pointing to culture and stories and law as the way we try to do that. And I wonder, do you see that sort of reining in other beings as well, or is it something we most of all, we strange humans most of all have to try to do?
I think that there must be reining in, because all beings subject to evolution by natural selection would be manifesting this will to live, right, to continue and pass on our genes. But how do we explain things like Suzanne Simard's wonderful discoveries about the sharing networks that trees have? That trees who have plenty are sharing with those who don't have enough. They're sharing with their offspring. Each it still manifests the evolutionary imperative to pass on your genes to the next generation, but they don't have to be passed on in your own physical self. They could be passed on in the well-being of your relatives as well. So I can think about mycorrhizal networks and forest networks as a kind of self-restraint. Or maybe it's more a dissolution of the self, that it's not the self that matters, it's the we that matters. And that's what a lot of ethics and culture suggests too. That's why we have those Windigo stories, to say you're not alone here. It's not just you that matters. We all need to survive here, and if we share and we're not that greedy cannibal Windigo, then we have a shot at it.
Thank you. You said here twice in your last two sentences. You said you're not alone here. We have a shot at it here, and I'm maybe because we're especially dislocated, talking to each other through a screen and being in different places. I want to try to ground us a little bit in the question of how we ground ourselves. So I think I'm moving towards questions about indigeneity,
Yeah.
about becoming native to a place. Um, I guess I want to ask, how, like, does does where you live feel like your home? Does it feel like your place?
I'm not sure what you mean by the difference between home and place.
Yeah, I just wasn't confident about how I asked it. I'm trying to ask about how, for any of us, what it takes for us to feel like we are of the place we are in. Sorry for the
Yes.
infelicity.
No, no. Because there could be a difference between home and place, right? And to me, home, the difference for me between home and place, and the reason I wanted to be sure I understood, is because home to me feels like a place where you belong. Um, and it's a place that you know and a place that knows you. A place where when you go home, you feel nurtured, you feel cared for, and you feel in a relationship with the other beings there, relationship into the history of that place, relationship to the future of that place. And that's what I mean by home. um, so how do we get there? How do um, just any old place become home? And in a nation that is as transient as ours, unlike Maple Nation, they know how to stay home. They are definitely rooted in place. Um, how do we, as people who move around a great deal, make a home? And one of those answers, of course, is to move around less, to be more rooted in your community, to to convert a place to a home. But to me, the way home, that sense of belonging, arises is through reciprocity, by participating in the life of a place. By and in reciprocity, we keep thinking about as how do we give back to place, but it's also how do we receive from place. Um, and that's part of being at home too, isn't it? Of it's a place where you're going to feel the love. People are going to take care of you. Your place is going to take care of you when it's your home. So I think letting a place give its best to you and you giving your best back is how you make a place into a home. It's by reciprocal exchanges.
And you point out in a couple places that in some ways this is the nation that calls itself the United States of America, which is, say, a late arriving nation uh, of immigrants and migrants for the most part, in contrast with, say, Turtle Nation or something like that. And I wanted to ask about, is there a is there a time horizon on cultivating belonging to a place? I might be asking this question in part because I'm in Washington, D.C., which is supposed to be our nation's capital. And walking around, it just feels like a very transient place. It feels like
Hmm.
people are here. And so, in preparing for this, I've been thinking about time horizons for the kinds of relationships that you're describing. So, to develop deep attachment to a place, what sort of time horizon do you have in mind there?
Mm. I really appreciate your thinking about that, because what another element to the richness of home is that it's the place associated with your ancestors, that the teachings of your ancestors are very much alive in that place. It's the place that they took care of so you could have it, or they laid a trail to that place for you to follow. And it's deeply intergenerational, not only in relationship with ancestors makes it more of a home, but relationship with yourself as a future ancestor makes it a home. So yes, I think the deepest relationships with place are built over time and over generations, for sure. But it doesn't. But beginning to create that relationship to place doesn't have to take centuries, right? It can happen as you begin to exchange and be in relationship to place. To think about the fact that maybe it's a bigger sense of home, that maybe it's not this particular parcel of land that my children are going to grow up on, but they're going to grow up on Turtle Island. And so it matters to me that Turtle Island is still green and beautiful, and that you can still drink the water and breathe the air. So maybe it's a sort of bigger sense of home. Um, and and that might be the antidote to our transience, is that we need to think about home in a bigger way, as Turtle Island.
Mm-hmm. And I think I said
You
turtle.
know,
Go, go
oh,
ahead.
another thing that I feel called to say is, when you were asking about how does a place become home, um, through attention, and knowing the names of your neighbors, right? When there you are in Washington, probably staying in a hotel, right? And you don't know anyone's faces. They don't know you. No one calls you by name. Um, that doesn't feel good. And um, and there's a way in which we, I think, cut ourselves off from feeling at home when we don't know people's names and faces. And that counts for all the other people too, the bird people and the tree people. Paying attention and starting to learn the names of the beings with whom you're sharing a piece of Turtle Island is a really, I think, fast way to start feeling at home. You know your neighbors. It's as simple as that. Paying attention to your neighbors, taking time to know who they are, so you can rely on them. They can rely on you. Um,
Yeah, which again feels like there's an implicit orientation towards time in that. Uh, that it takes time to know neighbors. It takes time to
it
be
does.
known. It takes time to look at very small plants that are in the crevices of rocks and start to be able to distinguish one from another, and why one is able to capture water and one is not. And in this case, it like your words have the function of uh, catalyzing attention, I think, in the reader. So when you say that it's important to use names, um, it makes me want to go back to sort of the theme of this series a little bit and think, uh, when you hear a name like the United States of America, does that feel like, what kind of how does that name sit?
The phrase that I and my colleagues often interjected is to say what is now called the United States of America. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
I don't. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think of it as artificial. Um, you know, um, does it feel? I'm asking myself, does that feel oppressive? To say that I live in the United States of America, I do, and there are many things about the aspirations of the United States of America that I treasure, for sure. And there are things that terrify me, and as well.
Mhm.
And I guess that's why I prefer to claim citizenship in Maple Nation. I recognize and acknowledge the United States of America as a reality, but the way I tend to function is that my responsibilities, I feel, are more to the land than to the political structure. That being said, I think that political action, back to your questions about civics and participating in those systems and trying to um, illuminate alternatives to some of those destructive systems is the job of a good citizen, um, to participate
And
ecologically as well as politically.
yeah, I mean, it's I feel like the project, they run in your thinking, they run both alongside each other, the ecological project and the political project, and they're completely threaded into each other. They can't be separated, and they work as metaphors for each other.
I think that's true.
I think it's hard to name, to use for beings the names that are appropriate, the right names. Can I ask, how do you develop confidence in the names you're using for beings?
Hmm. If by right names you're thinking, oh, I need to have a book that tells me what the right name is, you know, as a botany professor, I admit that's a lot of my work. These are the right names, but in fact, that's not how I teach my students anymore. When we're walking through the woods, and they're good botanists, biologists, they want to know the names of everything, and I don't tell them anymore because it's almost like a kind of consumerism. I just want to know that name, and that's all I need to know. So I thought, well, we can get to the name, but first let's look at this being. Let's smell this being. Let's see who it's friends with. Let's see who they are, and you come up with a name for that being based on your observations. I love this exercise because it decenters this Western scientific authority to say that that pine is called Pinus strobus. And really, that's all you need to know. A white pine is Pinus strobus. Who cares? You want to know, what are the medicines? How does it live? How long does it live? What does it sound like? That's how you come to know a pine, not by slapping a Latin name onto it. Once you know the pine and then you want to know more to access the literature, the scientific literature, it's good to know its scientific name, because it opens the doors, of course, to more knowledge. But to me, forming a real relationship with that being by using your gifts of observation is the way to really know them. And so, no, I don't think that folks ought to be saying, well, I don't have the time to study a book and learn what the name of that plant is. But I do know that little one with the purple flowers that only grows in the shade that the bees like to visit. That's all you need to know. That's as good as a name. You
Mm.
know them, whether you know their officially recognized name or not.
Mhm. So, Robin, we are moving towards closing this part of the program,
Already.
which I like the expression you just made. Um, and we invited people who were going to watch this to share questions. And I wanted to ask you, actually, if you lately, these days, whatever these days means, do you feel like you've had a persistent question or two in your head, some question that has recurred?
Yes, yes. And this is a question that, if I might, I would love to share with your thoughtful audience. And it grows out of the beginning of Braiding Sweetgrass with the story of Sky Woman, where your readers will remember in this creation story, she falls from the sky world to the new world, what becomes Turtle Island, right? And brings her gifts there, and so the world unfolds. There are a number of different stories about how she came to fall. There are some stories in which she just slipped. There are some stories in which, shall we say, she was helped along, because she had work to do but was reluctant to do it. The question that has been on my mind, knowing strong Native women, I don't guess it was an accident. What if she jumped? My question is, what if she jumped to a new world? And metaphorically, what do we need to do to jump to a new world? So much of the environmental movement, to my mind, has been driven by fear, by looking over our shoulders and saying, wow, something really bad is coming toward us. And they're not wrong. And so you jump to a new world because you're afraid of what's coming and afraid of what you've created. But the world that I want to live in is a world that is so beautiful and whole that you want to jump to it, so that you jump because of love, not because of fear. And the question that I have for readers is, what do we need from each other to jump? Yeah.
So that was a beautiful question and a challenging question. And both parts of that feel like a really good, if to me, early place to end. It also feels like the question about what we need to jump and the pointing back to beauty, which uh, it's there in both the way you speak and the way you write, and it's there in the attention you pay to all the things you pay attention to. And I think the way you think about science is that you can't separate it from beauty. And to leave us with a question that is both beautiful and challenging feels like it points us back towards the kind of revolution you're moving towards. So, as we prepare to close and invite those of you who have been joining us to join via Zoom to talk to each other with Roselle Medina's help, I guess I wanna just say an enormous thanks, Robin, for your thinking, your writing, and for being with us. And I want to invite you, if there's any last thought you want to share with us tonight before we shift towards the jump.
Mm. I'm really moved to think that you will be talking about that together. And it's such an important question. But I think I would want to circle back to where you invited me to begin, Adam, invited us to begin with gratitude. And when I hear the Thanksgiving address from my Haudenosaunee neighbors, or our Thanksgiving ways from Potawatomi people, we're saying thank you to the earth. And I treasure that little moment of quiet at the end when the words end, and think about how we might live in such a way that the earth would be grateful for us. And I want to always be listening for that.
Maybe we can go out then with that moment of silence and inviting everybody to listen. Robin, thank you.
Miigwech, thanks for having me.